and thanks for joining us. I'm Sue Maloney, and I hope the technology is working for you and that you can see and hear okay. In a moment I'm going to hand over to Helen from Magpie Media, and she's going to run through the finer points of the web. Welcome Graham Watts, who's coming to us live from the UK. Hi Graham, how's it going?
Hi Sue, good. Everything's very good here. Hello from the home of the Olympics.
Are you doing lots of watching?
Oh, well, absolutely. That's why I couldn't be with you today. I'm still sitting here waiting to be called up for the athletics team.
Excellent. Well, hopefully the call comes through. I'm going to hand over to Helen now to run through some of the webinar features. So, hi Helen.
Hi Sue, thanks for that. Morning everybody. I just wanted to draw your attention to the control panel that you see on your screen today, and this is what you'll use to interact with the presenters. So few things that you need to know how to do. One is how to ask questions. So you'll see that on your control panel there's a questions box and some type there that says enter a question for staff. So just type your questions into there, and don't forget to press the send button, and they will be relayed through to Graham. If for any reason you have issues with your connection today and you lose your you fall out of the webinar, all you need to do is use your access link to re-access the webinar again. And if you have any technical difficulties or want to ask any questions, just raise your hand. You'll see a small hand there on the grab tab, bottom of the grab tab on your control panel. Just raise that and I will come through to you in the chat box and see how we can help you today. The webinar will be recorded and available for viewing later on. Thanks. And back to you guys.
Thanks, Helen. And yeah, as Helen said, we do encourage you to ask some questions while the webinar proceeds, so type them in because we've left some time at the end for Graham to answer those. So we've been lucky enough to work with Graham Watts for quite a few years, dating back to when he was teaching at St Cuthbert's College here in Auckland. Now based back in the UK, his areas of expertise span thinking, habits of mind, gifted education, and recently a key focus for him has been hot tools, which combine literacy and thinking. Today though, Graham is going to share some recent UK research findings, which are based on a meta-analysis of international studies, around strategies which boost achievement for lower socio-economic students. He has promised us that the results are interesting and challenging. So I'd like to hand over to you now, Graham.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stu. That's very kind, very generous introduction. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be joining you all in Auckland. I wish I could be there in person, but for various reasons this year I'm not able to come over and work with Faye and her team, but hopefully I'll be there in person this time next year. The topic for us to explore over the course of the next hour or so is busting myths or exploding myths around what strategies or what interventions or what pedagogies are most successful in boosting the achievement and the attainment of students from low socioeconomic groups. The background, the reasoning that this focus has come to the fore in the UK in the last couple of years really came from a change of government in 2010 and the new reality that the days of having very generous spending on education in all parts of the UK has pretty much come to an end, and we probably won't see those levels of spending again on state education for a generation or so. So with the new government elected here in 2010, with the new education minister, one of the concerns that he voiced very early on was a lack of social mobility in all parts of the UK. In fact, in some places in the UK, social mobility has gone backwards. There's now less social mobility for example, from children and young people from very low socioeconomic background going to university. In some parts of the UK, there's less chance of that now than there was in the 1950s. So that was a clear concern for the new government. To help the focus across schools on children from low socioeconomic backgrounds, the new government came up with something called the Pupil Premium. Initially, it was called the Poor Pupil Premium, which I thought was rather Dickensian. I suppose it's good use of alliteration, but I guess one of their spin doctors suggested it didn't sound good for a Conservative government to have something called the Poor Pupil Premium. So the poor got dropped from it, and it's now just called the Pupil Premium. And this is a small amount of money that is allocated to students from allocated to schools that have students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And really the interest, the question was, if we are allocating extra money to schools that have students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, what works? What are the most useful, what are the most successful strategies for these schools to employ to achieve the type of outcomes that, that the government's talking about? What can we do in primary and secondary schools that will have the outcome of improving university entrance rates for children from poorer backgrounds? What works, not just in the UK, but if we look at research from around the world, what can we do? The particular aims for the Pupil Premium, the challenge, I suppose, given to the schools that receive the Pupil Premium, is to help improve social mobility, also to close the gap between the lowest and the highest achievers nationally, and more specifically, I mean that doesn't mean holding the gifted and talented back to make the gap smaller, but in particular, how do we tackle the tail of low achievement and low attainment amongst children and young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds? And specifically, there were certain communities that were recognized to have a history of being underprivileged, and very few young people from these communities were getting to university. For example, there are fewer British black young people at Oxford University now than there was 20 years ago. So there were certain communities within the broader spectrum of lower socioeconomic communities that are a specific target, and the measure that the government's put in place there is to see these young people going to the best universities, the top 20 universities in the UK. So that was what they were, goal that they have set schools. For every student that receives a free school meal, that's the measure or the indicator of low socioeconomic. Who receives a free school meal earns their school. Last year they earned the school an extra £466. In the year that's just finished, our school's finished about 10 days ago, those students were allocated an extra £600 for the school year, and that's moving up slightly to £676. The government has said that schools are free to spend this money however they wish. And they have said that the funding will last for 5 years. It's not going to go up in year 4 and 5, but it is a medium-term spending plan. The only restriction, I suppose, or the only accountability, that's a better word, that the government has said is that schools have to measure the success. So they have to embark upon some action research of their own to show that they are using the money effectively. In other words, they need to prove how they are taking the money, selecting interventions, pedagogies, approaches, whatever they choose to do, and measuring the outcomes that that's having for the children that receive free school meals. So let's have a look at the research. You're very welcome a wee bit later on if you'd like to research or to Google the Sutton Trust report. It was published just a year ago. The Google phrase is Toolkit of Strategies to Improve Learning. It's not very catchy. That's why Faye came up with Busting Myths. That's the longer research article, and if I achieve my goal, which is by the end of today you have more questions in 50 minutes time than you had when you walked in, I should be very pleased, and I suggest you Google the Sutton Trust report to find out more details. The report was conducted by a man called Professor Steve Higgins at Durham University, and he's well known, certainly in UK circles, for publishing some research about 5 years ago on the use of interactive smart boards. The previous government here had invested heavily in the use of smart boards, Prometheans, various different interactive whiteboards. And Steve Higgins led the research into the impact they had on attainment. Very interestingly, his research showed that in the first 12 months, the use of interactive whiteboards improved attainment in literacy and maths for Year 5 and 6 students, but over a longer period, over 24 months and certainly 36 months, the attainment was not significantly better than students who were using traditional static whiteboards or blackboards. So he's quite a well-known agitator, a person who comes in and perhaps blows up some of the myths and some of the fashions and fads that may be sweeping across education at the moment. The most interesting thing, and really a sign of the times, is the cross-analysis of Higgins' work. And he's not just looked at what works from looking at educational research, he's also cross-analysed this in relation to cost. Obviously, the Pupil Premium is a very specific amount of money. Schools already know how many children receive free school meals. That's worked out by the Welfare Department. So he has worked out not just what are the most effective pedagogies or interventions, but what are the relative costs, and by comparing the two, giving schools perhaps a fuller understanding, or perhaps a deeper understanding of what they might select or what approach they might choose if they are hoping to improve the attainment of their children from lower socioeconomic classes. The next half an hour or so, I want to explore some of the findings from the Sutton Trust report. Higgins explored 21 different pedagogies, approaches, interventions, 21 very generally, 21 different things that we do in school, all with the hope that it will improve outcomes, it will improve the level of attainment. I'm going to start off exploring those that have a very low impact when it comes to looking at student attainment. And actually within the low impact strategies, I've been a little bit cheeky and split this into the three headings that you can see there, from low to some strategies that in some cases suggested actually had a negative impact on student learning. First of all, let's have a look at some of the low impact strategies that were discussed in the Sutton Trust report. There were four approaches that Higgins and his colleagues classified as having a fairly low impact. I'll explain how they present their data. Obviously, you can see on the left-hand side we've got the intervention, we've got the pedagogy, we've got the thing that people do in schools to try to improve learning. The next column, we've got the months of progress added. Now that very simply means the average months of additional progress that you might expect to see in an average ability student who experiences this strategy for a whole school year. So looking at an average ability student, the student who will be sitting on the top of the standard distribution curve, if they follow this intervention for 12 months, this is the number of months progress that we would expect to see in their learning. The next column over is applicability. Higgins has done a meta-analysis looking at some of the different approaches, looking at data from all over the world. A very close to home example, one that would be very useful for you guys to tap into, of course, is the very useful work of John Hattie in Auckland University, who's done something very similar. When you can see the words that are typed in bold, that means that there was evidence that suggested that this intervention was particularly useful, or in other words, data that was collected on children from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So in the first example, we can see that out of all the data, the research that was explored, there was some evidence from children from low socioeconomic backgrounds in primary schools, and also some analysis of maths and English attainment, again looking at children from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So that column looks at, it gives you an idea of what sector really that we're talking about, and if it's in bold it means within that sector or that subject specifically there is evidence of impact on children from low socioeconomic background. And the final column we can see is the cross-analysis with value for money. So let's start exploring these and find out a little bit more of exactly what they mean by these different strategies. Now, if schools in New Zealand are anything like schools in the UK at the moment, there is, I suppose, certainly amongst the parent community and certainly amongst many teachers, many of our colleagues, there is a certain instant appeal to the idea of reducing class sizes. But certainly in terms of the Sutton Trust's research, there was very little evidence to suggest that this would have even anything more than a moderate impact on learning outcomes until the class size is reduced to about 15 or 20 children per class. Now obviously reducing the class size to 15 or 20 from perhaps an average class size of 28 or 30, that is quite a significant, well, over here it's financially impossible. So in terms of the analysis they looked at in reducing class sizes, they found that until you got to significantly smaller classes, there was no evidence that this was a strategy that improved learning outcomes, anything more than 3 months, a quarter of a year's learning, or for us it would be a quarter of an exam grade. Of course, the cost of reducing class sizes is prohibitive in many situations, and Higgins in his research suggests that perhaps it's not the size of the class that is the most significant. Perhaps it's actually what the teacher is doing, what pedagogies or approaches the teacher is using that is the most significant. So it doesn't really matter, he would argue, it doesn't really matter if the teacher teaches 15 or 20 or 30 children. It's not the size of the group that's significant. It's really what the teacher is doing and how learning is being managed or shaped that is the most significant factor in learners' achievement and attainment. Moving on to the next strand, we can see there after-school programs. Now this is quite a wide spectrum of different types of programs. Over here, quite a few schools have introduced something that we often call study club. After school, perhaps every night, more often, perhaps 2 or 3 nights of the week, there is a homework club or a study club that is made available to everyone, but there may be certain children who are regularly invited to come along. When parents perhaps have a concern about students falling behind or if a student's been off sick, often that catch-up time, that type of trying to recover lost time is run through an after-school program. In terms of the positive outcome, Higgins found that the average positive impact was about 2 months out of a school year for the students who took part in after-school programs. But what he found was that there was some suggestion, certainly in primary and English and maths in the secondary sector, that students from low socioeconomic backgrounds were the ones who most benefited from after-school programs. So much so, he suggested that possibly the invitation or I suppose the selection of students that are invited to after-school programs might be tailored or shaped to focus on perhaps an invitation-only system for children from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So he suggested that for a moderate cost that might involve paying somebody an amount of overtime, it might involve using teaching time after school rather than a teacher using every period during the school day. In some study clubs over here, the librarian or perhaps a teaching aide or teaching assistant or somebody else supervises that. The findings were that there's a low level of impact, but for those that did gain, there was a positive correlation with children from low socioeconomic backgrounds. The next strand they talk about is individualized instruction and learning styles. Now, by individualized instruction, we had quite a focus over here, probably 10 years ago, maybe 5 to 10 years ago on personalising learning. And there were quite a few individualised instruction programs. For example, in primary maths, there were teaching programs where there were perhaps 20 cards for division and 50 cards for multiplication, and depending on where the students were, they would choose card 5 for division, and they would work through card 5 and then they'd self-score it, and depending on their score they would go on to card 6, or if they did very well they'd jump to card 8, or if you were me you'd probably be told to do card 5 again but do it better the second time round. In that type of classroom, the role of the teacher is very much the role of the facilitator. There'd be very little whole class teaching and probably very little small group teaching, rather students picking up the curriculum where they've left off and moving on according to a predetermined measure. Similarly, here we can see that Higgins found that there was some advantages, some benefits from taking that type of program. And they found that that had particular benefit for students, low socioeconomic students in the secondary sector, mainly across all subject areas. It wasn't in any of the 3 core subject areas of English, Maths or Science. And those types of instructional curriculum cost over here between 1,000 and 2,000 and can be used by a whole year level at the same time. So that was suggested as a possible contender due to its low cost, but it's not going to turn the world upside down. It's not going to lead to huge leaps in progress. Learning styles, the models that they looked at were Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. I think there were 7, then there were 8, I think there's 9 now. There's probably a 10th. Yeah, don't buy the books yet. I'm sure there's another one on the way. And the other model that is used sometimes with younger children over here is VAK, Visual, Auditory, Kinesthetic. I suppose it's about a greater understanding that different people learn in different ways. In terms of the analysis of the use of different learning styles in schools, again, similar, 2 months of progress, so there is something to be said. There is some sort of low impact there, and certainly in terms of lower socioeconomic students, they found that it was most beneficial in the secondary context, particularly with the 11 to 14-year-olds using visual, auditory, kinesthetic ways of learning a topic, of learning history or maths or science, in order to boost their performance when they were taking an end-of-unit test or an exam of some sort. So those are what Higgins classified as his low-impact strategies. Let's move forward, or I'm not sure if it's forward, I'm not sure if it's up or down really, but let's move on to the very low or no impact strategies. And the one that leaps off the page here, so I'm going to start referring to it to begin with, is the reference to teaching assistants. Now this was the bit that the media grabbed hold of, and the teaching unions grabbed hold of, and lots of teaching assistants probably grabbed hold of. Higgins found no evidence that the use of teaching assistants in the classroom adds to the learning outcomes of any children. What he says about the use of classroom assistants, teaching assistants, is that, well, he suggests perhaps the question to pose, rather than saying what evidence is there that the use of a teaching assistant actually adds value to student learning, he says perhaps the question to pose might be to ask how the teaching assistant facilitates the teacher in teaching, and how the presence of the teaching assistant might improve classroom management, might speed up transitions from one activity to the next. So perhaps rather than looking at the impact of the teaching assistant individually, he suggests that perhaps the role of the teaching assistant is perhaps more holistic to the learning outcomes in the lesson. But certainly he could find no direct link between the use of teaching assistants and improving student outcomes. Now, I don't know what classrooms are like in New Zealand at the moment. I haven't taught in New Zealand since 2006. But over here, certainly in primary and in younger primary, most classrooms will have one teaching assistant in addition to the teacher. So this obviously for us caused quite a stir, and certainly when we've got 3 years of spending cuts in education that's now been extended to 5 years because things are not going well, that area around the strategic use of other adults in the classroom is certainly something that has generated lots of discussion. What is the best way of deploying the use of other adults in schools? Also in this group, well, what do we see? We see some mild, very low positive impact for the use of arts participation programs. It sounds very grand. Basically, these were artistic or creative programs that were often organized for children who were perhaps disaffected, children who perhaps didn't want to go to school, perhaps children who didn't necessarily feel that learning and school was for them or in their interest. A lot of the people who organise arts programs are charities or youth groups or youth workers who try to make schools a more engaging place for children and young people to be in. One of the findings Higgins suggests is it's very hard to compare programs because due to the nature of creative and artistic programs, it's very hard to compare one with the other. But he also says that the use of highly qualified and highly trained adults was linked to the most successful courses. So perhaps rather than using volunteers or people who hadn't had very much training, the courses and the programs that seemed to have the most impact, the ones that offered perhaps a month's positive improvement on learning, were the ones where the people leading the course were trained and qualified. I don't think that's a huge surprise. The other strand we can see here that made the teachers' press, but didn't make the general press over here, was the issue of performance pay. I'm sure most of you will know performance pay came in the late 1990s over here, and at the time it was the government's idea that it was something for something. We would, as a profession, pull our socks up sticks and try harder, and in return we would be paid for improved performance. In reality, the performance pay became a huge bureaucratic nightmare with collecting evidence and filling in forms and putting together a portfolio of materials that nobody ever looked at. And interestingly, 10 years on, Higgins, when exploring the link between student learning and performance, didn't find any evidence that introducing a performance pay system had any direct link to improving learning outcomes. So now we're going to move on and look at the I suppose we've gone from the bad, the badder, to the baddiest. These three interventions, these three approaches, according to the Sutton Trust, based on the body of evidence they looked at, the impact was, well, it's within the margin of error. In some cases there was a suggestion that this type of approach had a mild impact, perhaps 1 month, plus 1 month, but also data suggested that this, in some cases, retarded learning, was detrimental to the learning of children and young people. Ability grouping is always a hot potato. I'm sure it's, when I taught in New Zealand, it was a topic that came up for discussion from time to time. I was very fortunate in doing the certificate in gifted education at University of New South Wales in Sydney with Mirica Gross. And some of you, I'm sure, will have heard Mirica speak. She's often in New Zealand working with Learning Network New Zealand. She's a great believer, great advocate of ability grouping. And her argument is that ability grouping is very good for the gifted and for the most able. It brings together like-minded, able students who bounce off each other and make progress, make faster progress because they are working together. In the Sutton Trust report, Higgins and his team find something very similar. They found that the ability setting has benefits for some, but is detrimental to others, depending really on your place in the ability spectrum. The most able, the gifted, tended to be those that benefited from being set in ability groups, whilst the medium ability and especially the less able were those who were affected negatively. He found particularly with the less able from low socioeconomic groups in primary, secondary, and some data looking specifically at attainment in maths and English. He found that less able students from lower socioeconomic groups often, as a result of ability setting, lost confidence in themselves and their view of themselves as learners. I suppose in some ways he's saying they began to say that they began to see that learning is about some sort of innate ability, that kids are in the top set because that's the way they were born, and there's no point me trying very hard because I'm never going to get there. And that, as we all know as educators, is a very dangerous mindset, because that can then spiral downwards to there's no point in me coming to school, I'm not going to do very well, I'm not going to progress and achieve. So certainly in terms of ability grouping, that was quite a point for discussion over here, as ability grouping, certainly in secondary schools, has become the norm in the last 10 to 15 years. What else have we got here in the no impact or negative impact? Well, similarly, we've got plus or minus a month of progress or regression for block scheduling or timetabling. Again, something that is being adopted over here more so in secondary schools is the idea of, rather than having perhaps 5 one-hour lessons, instead a secondary school might have 3 lessons during the day. It might be 3 90-minute lessons. So start of the day, lesson 1, 90 minutes, morning break, 90 minutes, lunch, 90 minutes. And the thinking behind that is to do with developing higher order thinking, developing a deeper, richer understanding of a topic. Critics of the 30-minute lesson model have said that if children bounce from one 30-minute lesson to the next, the first quarter of an hour is usually recapping what they've done before and the teacher explaining what they're going to do, and then the next 15 minutes or so there's no time to think deeply. A lot of knowledge and understanding, but there's not much time to compare and contrast, time to synthesize, time to evaluate. So there has been a trend towards block scheduling. And very interestingly, again for educators over here, is the findings of Higgins and others that even with the best intentions in place, there was no evidence that this improved learning or had a positive impact or significant positive impact. In fact, in some cases, he found in secondary science in particular, he found that for children from lower socioeconomic groups, having a very long block, a 90-minute or 100-minute lesson, was detrimental to their learning, purely because they got bored, they were switched off, it was more of the same. I think that probably links back to the very first point we made, that it doesn't matter how long the lesson is or how many children there are in the classroom. The most important thing is what the teacher is doing and how learning is growing and being shaped in that lesson and in that classroom. And then finally, we see school uniforms. Now, I was a bit puzzled by this, because if you asked me to sit down and write down 21 things I might try in a school to try to improve outcomes, specifically for lower socioeconomic children, school uniforms wouldn't be on my list of things. I guess it's been improved here, because for many schools that may be in low socioeconomic areas, there is a pressure to relaunch. We are moving from, well, I suppose we're moving towards a tomorrow's schools model. I think that's what it's called in New Zealand, tomorrow's schools. So we're losing the link with local authorities. Schools are closing down at midnight and reopening minute past midnight with a new name, new head teacher, and often one of the first things that the incoming principal does is introduce a kind of Victorian-style school uniform, children in straw boaters and snazzy blazers and so on. The parents often love it, but in terms of improving learning outcome, Higgins found that it's well within the margin of error. In some cases it had a mild positive impact. In other cases the children felt completely alienated from what was going on, felt that they were going to a fancy dress party every day and kind of gave up on learning in school. Let's head towards a positive conclusion for our time together this morning and spend a little bit of time looking at the medium impact strategies and then finally looking at the high impact strategies. In terms of medium impact, you can see in the middle column there's a range of positive or advantageous contributions. We've got +3 months, +4 months, +5 months for those different strategies. So just recapping what we said earlier, that means for students who experience that intervention for a whole of a school year, on average made +3, +4, +5 months more progress than a student similar age, similar ability who wasn't involved with that program. So what's the most impressive one we've got here? We've got one-to-one tutoring. This was particularly significant, had a particularly positive impact on primary age children from low socioeconomic background. And by one-to-one tutoring, quite simply, as you would imagine, it means one adult working very closely, very intensely with an individual student. Often this is going to be a remedial intervention. This may be a student who's been identified as not making enough progress. They're not online to reach their SATs target or GCSE target or whatever it may be. So there is almost a pull-out, one adult working with one student to help them get back on track. Unfortunately, it's not working with a gifted individual to take them way further, to help them soar and rise above what may be going on in the rest of the class. The one-to-one tutoring model was very much based on remedial intervention. Higgins found it was most successful with primary age students in the area of reading and mathematics. So within literacy it was more, had more impact on reading than writing and speaking and listening. And he found that in a similar way to the summer program and the after-school program, the success of one-to-one tutoring, as I think many of us would predict, was greatest when it was led by a highly trained teacher rather than perhaps an untrained volunteer. One of Higgins' suggestions here is around the idea of whether it actually needs to be one adult with just one student. He said there's actually very little to suggest that that type of one-to-one ratio is actually any more effective than paired tuition or intensive small group work, where you might have an adult with, I don't know, a small group probably up to 5 or 6 individuals. But of course that would significantly change the cost of the program. Rather than having one adult to one student, which is going to have a significant cost, if we can have one adult to 4 or 5 children or young people, that makes it very much more affordable. And Higgins is saying there's very little evidence to show that this type of remedial intervention has to operate on a one-to-one basis. Pairs or small groups are just as effective in boosting children's attainment. Moving forward, ICT. Now ICT, that's something and everything, isn't it? It could be from using interactive whiteboards to being a laptop school, to children accessing information on their phones or Googling sites on their phones. What Higgins and his team drilled down and explored with information technology was really, well, 2 conclusions. They said that it's the way that technology is used that is most important rather than the technology itself. So for example, going back to the idea of interactive whiteboards, they found that having an interactive whiteboard in the classroom itself did not have any significant impact on learning. The level of training, the level of support that the teacher was given to help them use the full interactive range of strategies of an interactive whiteboard. That was the most significant part. That was where the impact on learning was achieved. And similarly, they found that there was very little evidence to show that ICT replaces teaching. They found that when ICT was at its most effective was when it was being used in a blended way with more traditional approaches. So rather than seeing ICT as something that has to be the beginning, the middle, the end, the core and the encore of a lesson, they found that the use of ICT in boosting student learning, student attainment, is best seen when the technology has been used skillfully and has been practiced skillfully by the teacher, and also when it is used in symphony with other pedagogies and other approaches in the classroom. Moving down the page, the next 5 interventions all have about 3 months positive impact on learning across the curriculum. Assessment for Learning, or AFL, I'm sure teachers in New Zealand are familiar with the Assessment for Learning model. Something that was a very interesting observation from the Sutton Trust report was despite all of the investment in training and resources in Assessment for Learning over the last 10 years or so, certainly here in the UK, there's actually very little evidence to show its impact on learning. So Higgins is accepts his data is very tentative. He found that the most positive results leading to this positive +3 correlation that we see on the screen was most found in secondary schools. And he couldn't tie it to any particular subject area or tie it to any particular year level within secondary. Obviously, that's 7 years of learning. He said in schools where Assessment for Learning is being used consistently, it became the way that they do things, the way that students learn, and that's where it seemed to be having a positive impact on learning. Where Assessment for Learning was perhaps used by 2 teachers out of 6 or by the science department, let's say. He said that whilst it may have given clarity to students in those particular classes, in terms of an impact across the school, in terms of a significant shift in student attainment, there was very little evidence to suggest this type of approach was being successful. Parental involvement was something I was actually very interested in. The last school I taught at here in the UK was a secondary school in Slough. Slough, as some of you may know, is just outside of London. It's near Heathrow Airport. I think its only claim to fame is it's where the comedy series The Office is filmed, and that's probably the only highlight of Slough. After having been teaching at St Cuthbert's College for 5 years, when I came back to the UK, I decided I was up and ready for a challenge, and this school had been the lowest achieving secondary school in Britain. So I thought this would be ideal for me to sharpen my teeth and practice my classroom management skills. They wanted an advisory teacher on thinking and learning. So I went into the school. They'd had, about 7 years ago now, only 4% of the kids had graduated. So only 4% of the kids had got 5 GCSEs when they were age 16. Kind of bubbled around 4%, 6%, 8% for several years. And one of the things that seemed to be lacking was parental involvement. And we tried a whole succession of different things to get parents in. In the end, we found it providing food for the parents at about 5 o'clock in the evening on the way home from work was probably the best way. And get me to stand up and start talking to them about homework strategies before they finished eating. Otherwise, they put their plates down and walk out whilst I was talking. We were certain that improving parental involvement would have a positive impact on learning and even simple things like attendance and punctuality to school. But looking holistically and looking at data from a much wider base than just that one school in sunny Slough, Higgins finds that actually there's not that much of a gain to be found from engaging parents in their children's schooling. He does note that whilst in the past it may have been an assumption that parents from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were the most difficult to get into school, to come to events, he, in his research, found that often it was parents from middle-class communities who weren't able to attend events because often their working day didn't finish until 6:30 or 7 p.m. and by the time they commuted, they weren't able to attend events at home, attend events at school. So for me, at least, that was quite a surprisingly low impact on students' learning. Higgins says that, I mean, there's very little, he says, that suggests that raising parents' aspirations for their children has any lasting impact on the children's aspirations themselves. But he acknowledges that there needs to be a lot more research and more of a breakdown on what parental involvement, what is successful and high impact parental involvement. The next approach is sports participation, and in a similar way, in fact, we can probably link this to summer schools because in many ways there are similarities between the two. The sports participation were programs often run after school or during the holidays to encourage kids to come to school, to help them see that there was something positive in coming to school for them, helping them find something that they could achieve in some area of school life that they could excel in. We see there a quite modest 3-month gain, and for moderate cost. Obviously, any type of sports program that's going to happen after school or in the holidays is going to have some on costs with staff and insurance and premises. In terms of summer schools, this is actually very interesting for several reasons, really. Most of the research on summer schools comes from the US. There was very little evidence, very little data provided from over here in the UK. What they found in terms of summer schools was that those who benefited were often, those who did benefit the most were those from lower socioeconomic classes, and they found that when the summer schools followed an academic program, rather than perhaps being a fun program or a technology program or a crafts program, when it followed perhaps a summer school academic program, there were significant gains in mathematics rather than in language or literacy or the arts. So based on the American model, certainly based on the American research, there is some evidence to suggest if there is a focus on improving maths and numeracy amongst children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, some sort of after-school or extra weeks learning might be something to consider, depending on obviously on the costs involved with that. Now, homework's an interesting one. Certainly in my time in school leadership, I don't think I've ever had anything that's aroused more ire and anger from parents and teachers than homework. I had more complaints and moans from parents about homework than anything else, and I could fairly evenly divide them, 50% saying there's too much homework, 50% saying there's too little homework. The research that Higgins looked at found that homework has a positive impact, mostly in the secondary sector. He found very little evidence to show that setting homework adds value to children in primary schools, so 5 to 11-year-olds. He found there was a correlation between the setting of homework in secondary school and certainly evidence in subject areas of English and mathematics that setting of homework improved student outcomes, improved learning outcomes for students. What he does say is that homework for secondary students should be limited to no more than 2 hours a day, because he found that for, which sounds more than enough to my mind, that after 2 hours the impact it has lessens, and the longer the homework goes on, it can move from a positive impact towards a negative impact. So there's some quite interesting ideas there about age range, subject, and the length of homework, length of total homework these young people might be doing at home after school. Let's finish off our time together this morning with looking at some high impact strategies. It's always nice to have something positive to go back to school and share with your leadership team and the staff and students. These were the four most significant strategies in terms of improving student learning. You can see there's quite a variety in the cost implications we see here. If we start at the bottom there, we see early intervention programs. Now, obviously by the nature of this, early intervention is going to be looking at the primary sector rather than the secondary sector. And we are talking about offering some sort of structured learning to children before they start compulsory education. So something before, in some cases starting at age 3, in some cases starting at age 4, before children go into the reception class. Over here there is a program called Sure Start, which offers, the trendy term is plearning, playful learning, plearning experiences for everyone in low socioeconomic areas. So if you live in Hackney, which is an area of social deprivation, it doesn't matter if you live on the minimum wage or if you are a millionaire, everybody in that area is entitled to take part in the learning centres. The impact the researchers found was significant. 6 months of progress from these young children. But of course there is a significant cost. Any type of early intervention is going to, any type of situation like this is going to have quite significant costs for child-adult ratios. There's going to be premises costs, there'll be insurance, there'll be resources, there'll be utility bills and so on. So there is a very considerable cost in setting up and maintaining these types of programs. But there is a potential there for 6 months of progress for the children in question, giving them a flying start for when they start compulsory education in the primary years. Moving upwards, we have peer tutoring or peer-assisted learning. I mean, I'm sure everyone in New Zealand, certainly when I taught in New Zealand, this was an approach that everyone was very familiar with. The idea that two students work together very closely, very intensely. They're involved in evaluating the success of one another's work. They're involved in teaching one another. They're involved in mentoring and buddying, helping identify success criteria. I'm sure everybody listening is familiar with the concept of peer tutoring and peer-assisted learning. The research here found, again, 6 months of progress, and really there's very little cost involved. I mean, unless the kids start turning around and saying, I just did 10 minutes of teaching to my buddy, I'd like to be paid for this. I can't really see there being any significant cost. The cost would be for us as teachers to be trained, for us to have time to share good practice in the staff meeting, for us to review our own practice, but certainly compared to the high costs of early intervention or buying hardware for ICT, the costs of setting up peer tutoring seem very modest in comparison. And then our penultimate approach. Now this made my heart sing when I saw this. Metacognition and self-regulation strategies. The self-regulation scared me a little bit. That sounds a little bit like you've got to eat prunes for breakfast. But very simply, put another way, it's using strategies that make students' thinking and learning explicit in the classroom. So this is where we have our thinking skills. This is where we have habits of mind. This is where we will have an inquiry model, where the children are very aware of the content they're learning, but they're also very aware of themselves as thinkers and learners. And we see here a very impressive positive 8 months advantage here for children who are metacognitive, who are aware of their own thinking and learning. And similarly, I would say there's a very low cost there. Again, it's like peer tutoring. It's about our practice as teachers. And top of the shop, closing our time together today, with a very impressive, positive 9 months of progress, we get effective feedback. Now this of course isn't going to be a surprise, but I suppose the thought I will leave you with is what Higgins identifies as effective feedback. What is it that makes feedback very effective? Looking through the data, he found that this is effective feedback focuses on what is right more than what is wrong. So it's looking for the positive rather than being perhaps overly diagnostic and looking at the negative. It's very specific. It's not talking about a page of text. It's talking about it's talking at the word level, the sentence level. It's offering very specific feedback. It's highlighting good things, good changes and achievements, not dwelling on past failures. And it's where there is clear encouragement rather than anything that might put children and young people off of learning. Now, if I were looking at how best to spend my extra money, my few extra beans, or if I were wondering how best I might improve the learning of children from lower socioeconomic groups, I think I would probably start off by exploring exactly what is effective feedback, perhaps exploring on the Sutton Trust website or Googling the report and seeing what you already do in your school and how you might add to effective feedback, metacognition, peer tutoring, and so on and so forth. We've covered a lot in the last hour or so. Certainly there are some conclusions to draw. Sometimes the things that are most effective don't really have to cost an arm and a leg. The cost can be relatively very low. And I guess it's really about what we do in the classroom rather than the bolt-ons or the extra programs or the very expensive equipment that we might bring in. And I would encourage any of you, and all of you, that perhaps you might want to encourage your own teachers to develop their own action research, to take these approaches, challenge the findings of the Sutton Trust, and see if in a few years' time there could be some data there that compares or contrasts the findings from the UK. I'm going to pause there and hand back to Sue.
Thanks, Graham. That was very interesting, and we've pretty much run out of time, so we're not going to go into questions at this point, if that's okay, but you can see that Graham's email address is up there, and I'm sure he's happy to answer questions that you might want to send through to him. We're also going to make this webinar available as a YouTube video, and we'll send you the link for that. What would be really great is if you could, we'd love to see you engaging in some conversation on our YouTube channel. Show your staff or your fellow, your colleagues the presentation, and yeah, put some comments up there, because I'm sure you've got some really interesting thoughts about the research that Graham's presented to us today and how that relates to New Zealand. Also, another thing that you might want to follow up with, and I'll send this to you as well, Graham has generously sent us 3 articles which relate to the low, medium and high strategies, and they are on our website. So what you'll need to do is just go onto our website, which is www.learningnetwork.ac.nz, and search for Graham's name, Graham Watts, and then on his facilitator page you'll find those 3 readings. As I said, I will send you a link to that as well. As you can see on the screen now, we have got Graham coming back to New Zealand next year. At the moment we've scheduled in 3-day courses with him, which is around his wonderful hot tools combining literacy and higher order thinking. But while he's here, we're sure to work him hard, and we may well schedule in some other events. And we're always delighted to bring the learning to you as well. So if you don't live in any of those 3 areas, talk to us about bringing Graham to you. If you can just move on to the last slide now, thank you, Graham. Just our contact details there, our social networks, and as you can see there, our YouTube channel is up there. So Graham, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you for working with us today and giving up valuable Olympic viewing time to work with our New Zealand educators. And finally, thanks very much to you who've been listening in. Do keep an eye out for more webinars. Our next one is scheduled for the 11th of September, and that's going to be with Bill Lucas. Bill works alongside Guy Claxton in the UK and is coming out to New Zealand later in the year, so we're going to be very excited to get Bill online for that. So over and out from me and the team, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to end the webinar for everybody now. So I'll count you out. 4, 3, 2, 1. Have a great day.